Normal life will go on to the very last moment, essentially until people are themselves in the gas chamber. So the fact that you are going about your normal life does not mean that fascism is not happening. And now, fast forward to the next century, we essentially have a live stream into the gas chambers. It's all right there. I'm sure there are little details here and there we don't know, but basically we know everything in real time. We're basically watching all of this horror live streamed. I mean, I just stayed up last night watching multiple videos taken by multiple people, of a United States federal agent at very close range firing bullets into the head, of an American citizen who was peacefully driving her car. We're watching that in real time. And in some sense, it's so horrific that we don't know what to do with it.
What do we do? Welcome to the Brad Carr Podcast. My guest is Dr. Marci Shore, professor at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and former professor at Yale University. Professor Marci Shore, when it comes to looking at the things happening in the world today, what is on your mind right now?
Well, at the moment, I was obsessively watching until entirely too late last night the videos of the 37-year-old woman, Renee Nicole Good, being shot to death by ICE agents on the streets in Minneapolis. And I'm not an expert on American politics. I mean, I'm a historian of Eastern Europe. Most of the commentary I do is from the perspective of being a historian of Eastern Europe, which is what I know. But as an American, I can't shake those images from my mind. That woman, Renee Good, I mean, she was a mother of a 6-year-old child. She was 37. She was playing the role of a legal observer in an ICE raid, on a kind of ordinary neighborhood street in Minneapolis. And there's multiple takes of video footage of ICE guys in uniform just shooting her in the head. And she's in the driver's seat of this car. And that could be, that could have been me. That could have been really almost anyone I know, any of my friends and colleagues. I mean, what she was doing in that situation was not at all radical. In fact, it is the standard advice, given to anyone who is not a Trumpist, that if you are on site when there are guys at balaclavas or ICE officers, or, in Russian, there's a special word for this, siloviki, kind of men of force, disappearing people off the streets. The wisdom is you're not supposed to throw yourselves at them. You're not supposed to tackle them. You're supposed to document what you see. You're supposed to take pictures. You're supposed to videotape. You're supposed to take notes. You're supposed to be a witness, be an observer. Which, as a not particularly brave person myself, is what I've always imagined, I would most likely do. I mean, assuming I was brave enough not to start crying and running away, but I don't see myself as someone who would throw myself on, men and start fighting with them. That would probably be laughable, but I could easily imagine in that situation, and certainly on the street I lived on, for, over a dozen years in New Haven, that I would be there doing the same thing. I would be watching. I would be taking a phone video. I would be making mental notes about what was happening. Any of us, could have been killed. I mean, these officers they just shot this woman in the head multiple times, right in front of everyone, and in front of other people, people just living in the neighborhood who were watching this raid on what struck me as a completely ordinary neighborhood street in Minneapolis. And so while there are horrific things happening both in my own country and in the world, every day, those images have particularly gotten to me.
So, Professor, for you, it seems that when you see these events, it seems to really connect with you. I've heard you talk about seeing a student at Tufts being taken, and you as a professor sort of projecting into what would I do if one of my students was there. How do you approach these things as you see them?
With a sense of rage and a heartbreak and despair. I can't say that I'm surprised. I feel like as a neurotic catastrophist and as a historian of Eastern Europe and as a historian of 20th century totalitarianism, I could feel it coming for quite a long time. I was an early panicker. I would say I started panicking by the late September, early October of 2015. But something that's not a surprise can nevertheless be a shock. I mean, I talk about February 24th, 2022 that way too. I was watching very closely what was going on. I knew perfectly well that there were Russian forces building up along the Ukrainian border. I was in constant contact with Ukrainian friends and colleagues. I was working on a piece for the Wall Street Journal on the topic. I was following the news very intensely. Nothing was a surprise, but it was still a shock. I understand quite well what it means to send out, siloviki, guys and thugs in mask, not operating under the rule of law with kind of free reign to violence. I know what that means historically. Like, I know how it can be unleashed. It's not surprising. But still, to see this 37-year-old woman, who was, by the way, an American citizen, she was in no way actually the intended target, of an immigration raid, shot to death in the head on this street, at very close range, intentionally. It's still a shock.
Mm-hmm.
And I also worry about the fact that we become more and more used to these things. There's a phrase in Russia that refers to a sensitivity threshold, and some of my sociologists studying Russia have said, well, Putin over time very systematically cultivated a sensitivity threshold that would inure people to violence, that would just allow people to become more and more habituated to violence. And that's not just a Russian thing. I mean, that is unfortunately part of the human condition. One of the things that gives human beings the potential for resilience is our ability to normalize the abnormal. That's what, allows us to go on, in horrific conditions. But it also carries the dark side that it allows us to come to normalize and to accept things that should never be normalized and to never be accepted. And I feel like, America is a country that has always had a lot of violence. We have the highest firearm per capita ownership rate in the world, as far as I know. We have a tremendous amount of street violence. And now we have political violence, on a scale that I don't recall seeing before. And we become used to it. It's the human condition that people become used to it, things that we should never become used to. And I feared for a long time that we're moving towards civil war. In any case, I'm thinking about this woman who is a 6-year-old child who is now an orphan because the father has also died. And I thought, we Americans are somehow tolerating this. We've allowed this to happen. We are all implicated. We're all implicated in the societies of which we're a part.
And Professor, you said you saw this coming. You're a professor of history. What in history helped you to see this coming?
Well, I would say there are various things, and there are two big categories I would use here. One is the legacy of 20th century fascism, Nazism, Stalinism, and the totalitarian experiences of the 20th century. And the second is the postmodern versions of tyranny, the post-truth versions that have come to us from Russia. And both of those things, which are quite different but interconnected, played out in my early panicking. I remember in these early Republican debates, there was a satire that came out in the New Yorker after one of the first few about the fact checker who passes out from exhaustion at the end of the Republican primary debate. Because of course nobody could fact check, as quickly as Trump was speaking, and even the publications and the news outlets that did the best fact checking, they were used to fact checking individual facts. They weren't used to a complete disconnect and untethering from empirical reality. Nobody can possibly fact check that quickly. And so it seemed laughable. I mean, it seemed comical. It seemed like this person is completely unhinged. He's pulling things out of the air. He's totally untethered. He's not recognizing reality. This is a little bit disturbing, but it's kind of a joke. There's no way he has a chance. And one of the reasons why I panicked, in fact, the main reason I think I panicked so early, was because I saw how this post-truth, postmodern kind of, I don't know, let's call it neo-fascism. I was watching what was happening in Russia and Ukraine, and I knew that it unfortunately could be extremely effective, despite the fact that it seemed laughable and ridiculous. And so I started panicking about that quite early, what the effects of this post-truth unhinging from reality, this kind of cynicism, were going to be. And then I also saw, one of the times that I panicked, preemptively perhaps, was back in 2008, which I know for your younger listeners will be too far in the past to remember, but when John McCain chose Sarah Palin as his running mate. And I've always been a person on the left. I was never going to vote for McCain. I was, unlike people like Anne Applebaum, for whom this was a deal breaker for her. She was a McCain person until Sarah Palin came on the scene. She comes much more from a kind of centrist conservative point of view. I've always been a person on the left. I was never going to vote for McCain. Nevertheless, I really panicked when I saw that alliance with Sarah Palin. And that reminded me very much of Europe, and especially of Eastern Europe in the 1930s, that alliance between the old right and the new right. And John McCain was the old right. He was the old conservative right. He was the kind of the old elite, standing for certain kinds of traditional American power, and a traditional ruling class. And as in Romania, when Antonescu makes the alliance with the avant-garde, and in Hungary, when Horthy makes the alliance with the Arrow Cross, that it takes the old right some time, too long, to realize that the new right is not just a younger, more invigorated, energetic, enthusiastic version of themselves. It takes them some time to realize that they're dealing with fascism, which is, a distinctly different thing. John McCain was still living in the real world. Sarah Palin was living in a totally fictitious world in which anything was possible, and she had no sense of constraint. She would happily rile up a mob to lynch someone. And John McCain would not. I think that's fundamentally not his personality and not who he was, whatever other compromises he may have made. And there was a scene, which, again, your younger viewers are likely not to remember, but it really burned itself in my mind. It was 2008 during the campaign. There was a rally. People were yelling and saying that, Obama was a bad person. He was a Muslim. He was an Arab. And John McCain got scared, and he stepped in and said, "No, ma'am. No, I'm sorry. That's wrong, man. He's not a Muslim. He's not an Arab. He's a good man. He's a Christian man. He's a family man. He happens to be somebody I disagree with on many issues, but he." And of course that was the wrong answer, because you've already accepted the premise that being a Muslim or an Arab is to be a bad thing. You've accepted what Jason Stanley would call a not at issue content that is snuck into the premise. But the impulse John McCain had, that he doesn't want that crowd riled up to lynch someone, that something is going too far. That I appreciated. And I think he got scared at a certain point of what he himself had unleashed. And when I listened to him give that concession speech in the November 2008 elections, I thought that a large part of him was relieved.
Mm.
I thought that he was afraid of what he had unleashed with Sarah Palin. I also thought that Tina Fey should have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize for the role that her impersonations of Sarah Palin played in their defeat. But I thought, like, that's the beginning of American fascism. And when Obama won, I kind of took a deep breath and thought, like, okay, there was this moment of danger, but it's past. And I was wrong. I mean, I was wrong that it wasn't past. It was still obviously brewing latently, just the way I felt, after January 6th, when, and after Biden and Kamala Harris were inaugurated, I had this sense of like, okay, we very nearly had a fascist coup, but it's past. But it wasn't past. We're still living that. We're still living that out now. It was clearly still brewing very latently. So I saw that the ability to rile up a mob and direct a lot of anger and resentment towards a scapegoat, that you saw in Sarah Palin with no constraint, and you saw in Trump from the very beginning this, lock her up, his snake poem that he read about immigrants as snakes, that scapegoating impulse that he was exploiting. You take all this energy and resentment, and anger in the crowd, and you direct it towards an act of violence. That's a kind of classic fascist moment, and historians recognize that. And that scared me as well.
Mm-hmm. Professor, we're talking about 20th century fascism, as you said, and this post-truth that, as you said, we're getting from Russia. Let's hold on to the part from Russia for a bit, and just what would you say defines a leader who is a fascist?
No. Oh, there's my friend Jason has written a whole book where he goes through this point by point by point, and of course, no two cases are exactly the same. But you have a cult of the leader.
Mm-hmm.
You have what in German is called the Führerprinzip, the leader principle. You have a scheme of us versus them, where you're defining the whole world into self and the enemies. You have an attempt to mythologize the past. So your nation was always great and probably martyred, and has never done anything wrong, whereas many people have done wrong things to you, but you're now going to avenge them. You get lots of insecurity about masculinity that kind of also comes up on the sidelines or something, sometimes not on the sidelines. You have suspensions of rule of law. You have a kind of increasing readiness to violence and a preparing of the regime for violence. You have a certain role of ideology. And in fact, it's the role of ideology that was so striking during the 20th century that feels so different now, which is for the past decade or so has been the difference, the postmodern difference I've really been dwelling upon. Things like Nazism and Stalinism had a vision. They had a vision of the future. It may have been false, it may have been based on lies, based on manipulation, based on scapegoating, but there was a narrative. It had its own kind of coherence to it. When you look at Trump and you look at Putin and you really I don't see any kind of coherent narrative at all. Make America great again, based on some kind of mythical point in the past that is never defined, and based on some kind of a future that is never defined. Stalinism had a future, again, false, based on lies, but there was a narrative that had its own internal logic. Now we're in this kind of nihilist abyss. Now there's not even an attempt to really justify performative sadism as existing on behalf of some eschatological vision, of a utopian future. Now we're just reveling in cruelty.
When you say performative sadism, what do you mean by that?
Well, this to me is if I had to take one dominant motif in American politics for 2025, I would say it's performative sadism. I think we've moved from casual disregard for the lives of other people, to the government's actually taking pleasure in reveling in cruelty. I'm thinking about, alligator Alcatraz. I'm thinking about one of the things that the official White House Twitter account did was send out a post when they were gathering up immigrants from Latin America to send to these notorious prisons in El Salvador. And Um, and they're chaining people's legs, and then they're taking video focusing on these men with their legs chained, and highlighting the sound of the chains rattling. And they post the video on Twitter, with, ASMR, which my teenage daughter had to explain to me was this Instagram genre of pleasurable sounds with this quasi-erotic overtone. So, we're supposed to take pleasure, in watching and listening to the sounds of the chains as these men are chained up and put on planes. Or for instance, you had that Kristi Noem makes that quasi-sexual video in front of the prison in El Salvador with all of those men stuffed like sardines, in that cage behind her. And she's saying, "Don't come here. Look what we're going to do to you." Yeah. And I thought this is sick. I mean, this is functioning as some kind of erotic enticement, for MAGA viewers. I thought this is just sadistic. We're in the realm of the sadistic. This is actual performative sadism.
And one thing that came up when you made the move to Canada and things was this idea of people saying things like, well, we still have checks and balances. What do you think is left of checks and balances on executive power in the U.S.?
Entirely too little. In 2016, I mean, I've repeated this so many times now, but the day after the election, I felt like everyone I knew kind of divided into two camps, or camps may be too strong a word, but, two different ways of coping. There were the hardcore, neurotic panickers, like myself, which included most of the Slavicist and East Europeanist I know who understand that things can slip really, really quickly. And then there were a lot of my Americanist friends and colleagues. Now, I should say no one I knew was happy. Nobody was taking pleasure in this. Nobody was satisfied. But, among the people who were less panicked, the mantra was checks and balances. This is bad. This is very bad. This is a bad thing, but we are going to get through this. We're the United States of America. We have the world's strongest liberal democracy. Our democracy is much more deeply rooted than democracy in other places. It is not going to crumble. We have checks and balances, and there was a feeling as if one, was in a kind of yoga class. I remember I took all these prenatal yoga classes in German in Vienna when I was pregnant with my son. And the phrase in German is einatmen, you breathe in, and ausatmen, you breathe out. And I kept feeling like, okay, breathe in, checks and balances, breathe out, checks and balances, and we've watched them crumble. And it's not that the system didn't have real checks and balances, but institutions are only as strong as the individuals who are in them. If they crumble, if they panic, if they sell out, if they run away, then they're no good. There's nothing magic about the institutions. They depend on human beings to defend them. And there were various moments. I think in some ways the most fatal was the 2024 Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity, which effectively gave Trump a blank check to be held accountable for nothing. And it's also in some ways an unprecedented situation, because one of the things I think that Trump did pick up from Putin is this idea of shamelessness, in disregarding law. Or disregarding law, disregarding morality. The anthropologist Natalia Rudakova calls this cynical disinhibition. The Slavic word is obnaženia, laying bare. The idea is you don't try to hide the fact that you're cheating, that you're corrupt, that you're breaking the law, that you're disregarding the law, that you're reveling in cruelty. You just lay it all out there. And the opposition was unprepared for a situation in which the executive power was just going to say, well, we're going to do what we want. It's not that everybody has sold out. I mean, you saw when they took the student from Columbia away, you had these judges, not in the Supreme Court, which is clearly sold out, but the lower courts were saying, no, you're not allowed to do that. You have to bring him back, we have habeas corpus, like this is not legal. And the executive branch is just saying, fuck you, we're going to do what we want. And then it's a question of, is somebody going to use force? Is somebody going to stop him? Because even when you say, okay, the checks and balances are functioning because these judges and these courts are saying, no, you're not allowed to do it. You have to bring this person back. But what happens when the president says no? We're in sui generis territory. And in that sense, I think the checks and balances have been eroded. And the Republican Party has just fallen. They've made these Faustian pacts with the devil. In a way that even in my neurotic imagination, I had not imagined would go so far. I mean, after that grotesque Oval Office meeting last February with Zelensky, Lindsey Graham said right afterwards in an interview, he said, Donald Trump has just given us a masterclass in putting America first. And I rage tweeted back at him. I said, no, Donald Trump has just given us a masterclass in moral nihilism. And Lindsey Graham has just given us a masterclass in selling one's soul to the devil. And those are people I would not have necessarily expected to a person to sell their souls to the devil. Like Marco Rubio sitting at that meeting, he knew he was taking part in something that was wrong. I mean, you could tell he wasn't pleased about it. It's not what he would prefer to be happening, but he's going along with it.
Professor, you mentioned things that Trump has taken from Vladimir Putin. What else do you think he's learned from Vladimir Putin?
Well, there's I can throw in some Russian words here,
Please.
As a nerdy academic. One thing you have that goes back in Russian history and Soviet history, Tsarist history, way before Putin, is a word called произвол, which literally means arbitrariness. It's arbitrariness kind of already tinged with tyranny and the possibility of terror. All the way back pre-Soviet Tsarist times, the liberal Russian intelligentsia in the 19th century was fighting against произвол. And what this meant was, this arbitrariness meant that the powers that be can do whatever they want to you, whenever they want, with no particular reason whatsoever. That you're just an object, that you're just a plaything that can be toyed with, by the powers that be, that it's the opposite of rule of law. There are no rules, anything kind of happen at any moment, and this sense of you never know where it's safe to be. You don't know what a safe side of the line is because they can come for anyone at any time, not necessarily with any reason. And one thing that, that not only Putin, but, the Tsarist, Tsarist rulers had understood, and certainly Soviet rulers, and especially during Stalinist terror, had understood, is that the arbitrariness of terror atomizes people. Because it makes everybody feel helpless all the time, and it erodes bonds of solidarity. People retreat into themselves because you never really know where there's a safe space, and you hear someone coming to the door at night and you just hope they're coming for your neighbor and not for you. And I see this with these ICE raids. I've seen that especially, in this second Trump administration, the idea that they can just come take anyone away at any time. There's no more habeas corpus. And you don't know, these guys show up. You don't know who they're coming for. You don't know what the rules are. You don't know when they're coming, and that causes people to retreat. It causes people to put their heads down and grow quiet. And it's a very effective method of terrorizing people. To me, that's one of the most important things he's taken from Putin. Another thing, and you can argue whether this was always Trump's general worldview to begin with, is a Russian word called продажность, which is literally saleability. The closest English equivalent would be venality, but without the kind of Victorian register. And in Russian, продажность is a second word for corruption, but it refers less to a kind of particular instance or act and more of a kind of existential state or a quality of a person. A person can be продажный, which means that they can be bought and sold. They're willing to sell themselves. And this idea that, Trump uses this in the sense of I'm the deal maker, right? Let's make a deal. And this idea that everything is for sale, that all human interactions are essentially transactional. There are no real relationships. There are no friendships. There's nothing such as real trust. There are no values. There's only this transactional idea that anything can be bought or sold. There's another word in Russian, сделка, which is in my head because I was listening this morning to an interview from February 2022 with Putin's former spin doctor, Gleb Pavlovsky, who is no longer alive. He died several months into the full-scale invasion, but he was one of the creators of Putinism. And he later was very remorseful about it and broke with Putin around 2011 in the Bolotnaya protest and spent the last years of his life critiquing the system he had created. But if you listen to Pavlovsky, you'll hear that he doesn't talk about government and legislation, in Putinism. He talks about sistema, which is just the system we created, and сделка, which is deal. It's all about making a deal. And for Trump, everything is about making a deal. It's all a casino game. There's nothing else. There's no values underneath that. When Trump says to Zelensky, you're not holding any cards, and Zelensky says, we're not playing cards. That's actually a very profound exchange because it captures the most significant difference in worldview. So I think that is as well, that sense that, anything and anyone can be bought or sold. Everyone has a price. It's a kind of anti-Kantianism. If you go back to Kant, and Kant's famous definition of a human being, Kant says anything that can be replaced by something of equivalent value has a price. Anything that is beyond all price and admits of no equivalent has dignity. Human beings are distinguished in that they have dignity. Well, one thing that Trump takes from Putin is that there's no such thing as dignity. There's only price, and everyone and everything has a price.
So if everyone is atomized, everyone can be bought or sold, then the argument is that makes everything open for influence, and loyalty, values, these things can go out the window.
We're just in this world of mafia. I mean, we're in a world of gangsters. We're in the world of thugs, and there's not even an attempt to kind of pretend that they're not thugs. I mean, this is the thing that I think we got so wrong in the first Trump administration. And so many of my friends and colleagues, especially the ones, who come from the legal opposition, people at the law school, really had faith in the Mueller report. And the faith in the Mueller report was in many ways like, a faith in checks and balances, a faith in law, a faith in legality, and a faith in truth. And the sense that when, that Mueller was going to get to the truth, he was going to expose the truth. When the truth sees the light of day, there are going to be laws governing the implications of that truth, and that's going to save us. But the mistake we all made was that the problem was not what had been concealed. I'm sure there were things we didn't know, but in some ways they weren't essential. The problem was what we had normalized. This kind of cynical disinhibition, this total disregard for anybody else's life, which Trump has thrown out right in front of us from the beginning. And it's so outrageous that we were not taking it in. I mean, Natalia Rudakova gives this example early on in Putinism of the moment when that submarine was sinking with the Russian sailors, and everybody knows where it is and that they're running out of oxygen, and various teams of divers, rescue workers from other countries offered to go rescue those workers. And Putin wanted nothing to do with it. And he later gives this interview on CNN. And they ask him, well, what happened to the submarine? And Putin just smirks and says, oh, it sank. So this shamelessness, Trump stands up there every day and shamelessly tells you, about all of the ugliness, all of the racism, all of the violence. It's right there in front of your face. And that's so outrageous that it disempowers us.
Is it too late, Professor? Have we already crossed the threshold of no going back from this sort of way of the world?
This is a popular question. Is there no going back? In history, we never go back.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think there's any going back. There's no return to status quo ante. But that doesn't mean that there can't be something better going forward. But it has to be something new. This idea that we can turn back the clock and we can retreat and we can pretend we don't know things that we now know, I don't think that's possible. I think it has to be something new. I think it has to be something different. And I should say, despite the fact that I'm a neurotic catastrophist, that, there are really good people,
Yeah.
out there. European journalists keep asking me, why is there so little resistance? Why are Americans tolerating this? And one thing I keep saying is there's really more resistance than you realize. There's a lot of resistance, including a lot of small scale local efforts. There are a lot of ordinary people being much braver than you might think. With some colleagues at Indiana in the New School, we started a little website on small acts of democratic resistance, just trying to document some smaller local initiatives, just as a resource, both for solidarity and mutual support, but also for foreign journalists looking for examples of resistance. There are good people in Washington. There are people I would trust personally. I would trust Jamie Raskin. I would trust Jasmine Crockett. I would trust Chris Murphy. There are good. It's not that everybody has sold out, but the good guys are clearly losing at the moment.
Hmm. It seems a lot of this is about attention, too. I know that you cite Hannah Arendt a lot in your work. One thing that I seem to take from reading her is that when there's a strong man, by giving them so much attention, they seem to also absolve both their supporters of responsibility for what the strongman is doing, and also the opposition is sort of absolved because, wow, the strongman is so strong. What do you think about attention that we give when it seems that Trump is maybe the greatest of all time when it comes to getting attention?
It is something extraordinary. The performative nature of his presidency, the postmodern nature of the effacing of the boundary between reality television and television.
Hmm.
Everything is a performance. I mean,
Hmm.
you think about these AI video. I mean, this AI generated video of beach casino ethnic cleansing Gaza fantasy, and you don't even know. Like, one runs out of language to even describe what's I mean, it's all a performance. It's all a performance in which the boundary between reality and non-reality, this is also something coming from Russia, is just being effaced. There's a willful non-recognition of the fact that any kind of boundary like that actually exists. And apparently he is a brilliant performer. I mean, I find that I'm just so viscerally disgusted, by him. It's difficult to see. I was Karen Attia, who was recently, fired from being the global opinion editor at the Washington Post for political reasons, who is an extremely impressive figure. She was here at the Munk School several weeks ago giving a lecture. She's fantastic. She's someone else you should interview. But among the things she said that terrified me the most was that she said, as a journalist, she had been several times, personally, physically in the room with Trump, which is an experience I've never had myself. And she said, it is extraordinary the kind of magnetic effect he has on people in the room. That he walks in and there's something about his energy that people are mesmerized by. Not Karen, but she felt it,
Oh, yeah.
each time with people around her. And among all the things people have said, that really stuck with me, because she's clearly a very keen observer of other people. And she said there is some kind of mysterious charisma that he captivates people, that people want to be around him. And the narcissism, you would think it would just be a self-parody, this obsession with naming buildings after yourself that's been going on for decades. I mean, really, it's seriously comical. There's a famous Polish novel by Henryk Sienkiewicz about Nero, back in the times of Rome, and, his pathological narcissism, and how everyone has to fawn over him with all the compliments and the obsequious fawning, and that he's the most wonderful musician and the greatest poet, and, and it's, there are these comic moments, in this very long, overwritten, in my opinion, novel, but also a kind of classic novel. And I'm like, we're in this comical Nero-like situation where, he names the Kennedy Center after himself, and, his press spokesperson says that, oh, he was a musical virtuoso as a child, and he sees rich arrays of colors where other people only see black and white, and, he's the greatest genius, and this is what they said about Ceausescu, the genius of the Carpathians, the brain of the Danube, and I mean, these things should be parody. They should be satire. But Trump is actually, in some bizarre way, he's mesmerized people into his cabinet meetings when they're filmed. It really does look like this North Korean parody where, like, he's the greatest of all time. No one else in the history of the Nobel Prize has possibly deserved it, as much as you, people falling all over themselves, and he takes it and he glories in it, and he's responsible for nothing except that what is good. He's never blamed for anything, and he takes credit for the entire world, and he just likes putting his name on things. And it's sick. It's pathological, and we can all see it. It's right in front of us, but there's clearly something about it that is mesmerizing to people.
Yes, people who listen to my show regularly will know sort of the signs of a pathological narcissist, and I've been around one very closely, and he is the caricature of narcissism, but it came on slowly, and so the people who have known him for a little while are just sort of desensitized to the point where everyone just plays along, and he is this sort of madman at the center of attention. So I understand how it happens. I wonder, I've heard you say that everyone is sleepwalking. I mean, what do you think wakes people up?
That's a good question. I've particularly been obsessed with the fact that the Europeans are sleepwalking.
Mm-hmm.
That they have not fully taken in that this is it, the end of the affair. You cannot trust us. And it's taken me a long time to realize how deeply that goes in Europe. I think I had an understanding of why it was very hard for people in Eastern Europe, and especially people of my generation and older who were really formed by the communist experience, to give up on America, because America was the anti-Soviet Union. It represented everything that communism was not. It was the other side of the wall. It was the place you could escape to, and I was empathetic to why it's very hard to give up on that. But I hadn't previously appreciated just how deeply that went with West Europeans who never had that experience of being on the other side of the Iron Curtain. One thing I found talking to European journalists in this past year was that journalists kept asking me, they even like the French and the Germans who, on the one hand, like they know that America, we're a barbarian country. We don't have real culture. We don't have culture. We only have a cultural industry. We have silly romantic comedies in Hollywood films. We don't know how to hold a fort correctly. All of those things, which, may very well in generalization be true. But it turns out that a little bit under the surface, there's still this sense of, but even so, America's the land of the free and the home of the brave. It's the arsenal of democracy. Things can't fall apart there, but surely, surely this can't happen in America. And I've literally felt, talking to European journalists, you are just as smart as I am, as if I'm playing the role of kind of psychoanalyst trying to coax people out of their Freudian denial that what they see right in front of them is actually what's there. I feel like I keep saying, like, okay, let's just look at what's right in front of us, because I have no secret intelligence that you don't have. We're all watching, we've all been watching for 10 years. We've been watching how toddlers were wrenched away from parents at the Mexican border and thrown into cages. We're watching how people have been disappeared by the streets. We're watching how Trump incited an insurrection, a violent insurrection on the Capitol, how he encouraged people to hang his vice president, how he called up the Secretary of State of Georgia, and said, I want you to find me 11,000 some votes. Like, it's all right in front of us. It's not a secret. It's not hidden. And yet there's this denial that what we're seeing can actually be happening. I mean, Europeans have to really give up on America and mobilize themselves.
Give up on America in the sense that give up on the hope that America is going to just pull through on its own and that Europe is going to just wait and watch? Or what do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, I mean, I feel like they have to make sure Ukraine wins. They have to make sure that Putin's regime is brought down, because they are a hair's breadth, from the Third World War in Europe. The idea that you keep waiting for America to save you and America to give you permission to send this and do that, like that just has to be over. Yeah, and I don't know what exactly it will take to wake people up. I mean, I felt like that Oval Office meeting with Zelensky did have an effect, but it didn't last long enough. Some of the Alaska summit where you watch Trump welcoming Putin on this red carpet. I mean, I was watching that. I was in Poland at the time, and I thought I should write about this. And I literally felt like I had run out of language to express my disgust. Like, what else? What else can you possibly say? This man is a mass murderer. There were moments at which I felt like the Europeans started to understand it, and they kind of go back to their, well, we're going to talk, and we're not really going to do anything. And that, I mean, now maybe Greenland. I mean, who would have thought we would invade Greenland? I feel like the MAGA enthusiasm for invading Greenland, I strongly suspect is enthusiasm largely by people who a year ago were not even aware that there was such a place as Greenland.
Yeah. And we've just captured the leadership of Venezuela.
Yes, we've just captured the leadership of Venezuela, and who openly, because we then think we can take their oil. I mean, there's not even really a pretense, that we're concerned about democracy in Venezuela, or we're concerned about Venezuelan citizens who have been brutalized by a horrific dictator. I mean, I have no sympathy whatsoever for Maduro. But obviously, Trump could care less, about the people in Venezuela, and he's very interested in getting their oil.
Mm-hmm. Professor, I've heard you say that the issue is people's ability to grasp things in real time.
Yeah.
What do you do to help yourself to grasp things in real time, to know what's true?
Oh, that's an excellent question. It's like the question of how do you wake people up? A lot of 20th century philosophy was about how are you able to see what's right in front of you as you're seeing it?
Yes.
I mean, Husserl and phenomenology, which I work on, but I won't bore you with, had a kind of esoteric philosophical process to try to achieve pure seeing, which was, in some ways kind of madness, but the impulse was understandable. Viktor Shklovsky, the Russian formalist, believed that it was poetic language. It was language that describes things in a way that is somehow weird or alienating or strange or not the way that objects are usually described, and that disorients us. And that disorientation kind of shakes us into seeing. So it's all about, in some ways, shaking ourselves out of habituation. Because I think our natural tendency is to normalize and to habituate. Is to kind of go along in whatever groove that we're in. And I try to be aware of that. I think one of the most profound things I heard after the 2016 elections, which was, I fear, largely considered a joke, was what John Oliver said on his show after November 2016's elections. And he said, everybody get out a Post-it note, write, "This is not normal," and stick it on your refrigerator. Because you are going to forget. You're going to start thinking things are normal that you never would have believed you could have thought normal, and you have to keep reminding yourself this is not normal. And so I try to have that this is not normal kind of constantly every morning, but I definitely don't pretend that I'm the person who is able to fact check every, bit of information as fast as it's coming. And of course, all of the internet manipulation is a moving target because it gets more sophisticated literally day by day. I mean, we can't even keep up with, our students using AI, and then you ask students to, okay, well, you have to, run your assignment through a plagiarism detector, through an AI detector, through X or Y, but we can't keep up with these methods as quickly as the technology is evolving. And I think that's the other factor that makes the present moment sui generis, that makes it really deeply different from the 20th century. Because the technological possibilities for disseminating misinformation today are historically unprecedented. I mean, it really is a situation that, Hegel would describe as quantity turning into quality, changes in scale becoming, changes in kind. This was just unimaginable in the 20th century. I mean, I keep thinking about, when we're looking at, we're looking at the fact that people are being tortured in prison in El Salvador, and that is our tax money. This is one thing I tweeted recently. I'm like, I am responsible for that too. We are all responsible for that too. That is our tax money being used to grab people off the streets with no just cause, with no due process, with no habeas corpus, and send them into a notorious prison in another country where they're being tortured. And we're paying for that. We are all implicated in that. And all that is happening right in front of our eyes.
Right in front of our eyes. That's this strange sticking point, is that it's all happening. It's not secret. It's totally out in the open. What was the word used? Obnažení?
Oh, obnažení, this laying bare. Oh, Karski, I was going to tell you about Karski. So Jan Karski was a Polish underground courier, a member of the resistance, extremely brave, a very young man, tortured by the Gestapo, who was smuggled by Jewish colleagues, and in particular a Bundist, into the Warsaw Ghetto, and was given intelligence about where the trains were going and what was happening in Treblinka. And he makes this heroic, and extraordinarily dangerous trip across war-torn Europe with a microfilm report and a tooth that had been extracted to get to the Polish government in exile in London, to get to Churchill, eventually to get to Washington, to try to bring the Allies news of the Holocaust. And the news was so fantastical, this idea that people were being mass murdered in gas chambers, that people couldn't take it in. And there's a famous scene where Karski goes to Supreme Court justice, and the justice says, "I'm sorry, I'm unable to believe you." And Karski says, "Sir, are you accusing me of lying?" And he says, "No, I'm not accusing you of lying. I'm just unable to believe this." And now, fast forward to the next century, we essentially have a live stream into the gas chambers. It's all right there. I'm sure there are little details here and there we don't know, but basically we know everything in real time. And some of it is going to be fake news, and some, and things have to be fact checked, but we're basically watching all of this horror live streamed. I mean, I just stayed up last night watching multiple videos taken by multiple people, of a United States federal agent at very close range, firing bullets into the head, of an American citizen who was peacefully driving her car, and we're watching that in real time. And in some sense, it's so horrific that we don't know what to do with it.
What do we do?
We have to do
what does history tell us?
Yeah.
I mean, you're a professor of history.
No, it's an excellent question. The one comforting thing that I heard very early after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, it must have been late February or March 2022, is that PEN International, the writers' organization, had organized a series of talks between Ukrainian writers and writers from other places, and I was doing one of these online talks with my colleague Oksana Forostina, a writer from Kiev. and it was being hosted by a PEN official who had written and reported from Southeast Asia for a long time. And after the talk, when the Zoom was over, he stayed on the line with me and Oksana for a few minutes and said, I don't know that this will be comforting to you at all, but the one thing I know from all of these years of reporting in Southeast Asia is that sometimes a tyrannical regime seems most stable 5 minutes before it falls. So this keeping in mind that even in the most tyrannical regime, there are always cracks. And there's always the possibility of the black swan event, of the contingent moment. I think about how Ceausescu's reign ended, in December 1989 in Romania. It just seemed that was so brutal and so violent, and so vertical, and so cult-like, that it was going to continue forever. And he's having a big rally and everybody is cheering for him, and then one guy starts shouting boo, and just at that moment, the other people around him catch on, and then more people catch on and more people catch on. And within 15, 20 minutes, it's over. All of those years, and it's just over. Now, if that guy hadn't been there, if he hadn't felt brave, if he had been standing in another part of the crowd and the people around him didn't join him, that was extremely contingent. You don't know, when you need a critical mass of people crossing to the other side of fear at the same time. And that's very difficult to get because you have legitimate collective action problems. That anyone acting rationally has a reason to think that the personal risk and cost that they're taking and paying for an individual act of resistance is greater than the overall social benefit, given the unlikelihood of actually overthrowing the regime. And of course that what's true and rational at an individual level is kind of suicidal at the collective level, because it's all of those collectively individual rational decisions that allow tyranny to continue. And there's always that possibility. And that is, that's the miracle of revolution when it happens, when you have a critical mass of people crossing to the other side of fear at the same time, and it's often provoked by some kind of contingent event you wouldn't have expected. And that's what happened in the Ukrainian revolution, right? Yanukovych, November 21st, 2013, Yanukovych suddenly says, a pressure from Putin, I'm not going to sign the association agreement with the European Union. Lots of people, the opposition, especially young people, students, are completely devastated. They feel like their future has been closed off. Europe has been closed to them. They're going to be stuck in this post-Soviet purgatory. Nothing might have happened had not, Mustafa Nayyem, this 32-year-old, Afghan Ukrainian journalist, posted on Facebook in Russian, a couple sentences saying, hey guys, let's get serious. If you're really upset, come out to the Maidan by midnight tonight. Likes do not count. Now, he might not have posted that.
Yeah.
He might not have had internet access that day. Somebody might have forgotten about it. He might have been sick. Anything, the fact that message happened to be the thing, that triggered a revolution in ways that perhaps nobody could have expected. And in some sense, it's always like that. It seems impossible until the moment revolution happens, and then it retrospectively seems inevitable.
Professor, you're saying that collective action is the key, and there's this idea of saying something, of speaking out. It seems we're in a place now where the risk is lower that I'm not going to have internet access, and it's much more that I'm going to be drowned out.
Yeah.
There's too much noise. In your book about that Ukrainian revolution that you're talking about, you use the metaphor of sirens when talking about Putin and propaganda. Yeah. And then, there's Odysseus who deals with the sirens.
That was Yurko Prohaska's metaphor, yes, the sirens.
Yeah. And there's Orpheus who makes noise instead of making music and drowns out the sirens. Now, when we are being drowned out, when the sirens seem so loud now, what do we do in all the noise of the year we're in?
It's a really excellent question. And again, in some ways, this is a sui generis problem. I mean,
And what does that mean? I'm sorry.
it's a kind of original problem that hasn't come up this way historically in
Okay.
the same form. Because it had been, and this is the material I feel very close to because it's what I work on historically. Like so much of the dissident philosophy, especially but not only after 1968, under conditions of censorship, was based on faith in the power of truth.
Yes.
The belief was that the truth was being squashed, the truth was being hidden, it was being concealed, it was being censored, it was being silenced. And if you could just let that truth get out there, it would have its own power, that the truth would liberate you. Havel's whole, living in truth. This, when the dissidents in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe talked about truth was as real as the keys that you hold in your hand that can unlock your doors. I was reminded of this when Alexander Vindman, his testimony at the first Trump impeachment trial, he ended his opening statements by saying, Alexander Vindman, for your viewers who might not necessarily know, he was not only was a high-ranking military officer and a member of the National Security Council who was on the phone call between Trump and Zelensky, where Trump tries to, pressure Zelensky into digging up dirt on Hunter Biden. But he was also a young defector as a child from Soviet Ukraine who came over with his brothers and his widowed father in the 1970s, and they escaped from the Soviet Union. And he ends his opening statement at the impeachment hearings by saying, "Don't worry, Dad. Here in this country, I don't have to be afraid to tell the truth." And when I heard that, I just wanted to hug him. I don't know him at all. It was so earnest. And I also felt like that kind of faith in truth is only something that somebody who escaped from the Soviet Union would have. Americans don't have that faith in truth. But it was so much in that spirit, of the dissidents and of the people who went to, like Václav Havel and like my friend Adam Michnik, who went to prison, for speaking the truth and for believing that there was such a thing as truth. Like that was that faith, pravda. That wasn't even truth in the English sense. That was pravda in the sense that you believed in truth. And now we're in this very new situation where the problem is much less that truth is being censored. There are lectures being canceled, including, for myself and, people who are taking things off syllabi and purging things from libraries. But basically, we're in an internet world where you can get out there. What you want to say. The truth can get out there. But yes, it's less being silenced and more being drowned.
Yes.
As you say. And this is a new problem. This is a problem that, again, the technology didn't previously exist to disseminate information with this volume before. It's historically unprecedented. The idea that you can get any kind of thought in your head and send it out to the entire world with no screening at 3 a.m, at any length, in any form you want. And nobody could have imagined this before. And so that, how we deal with that, is, I'm struggling with it every day. How do you, the sense that your mind is being bombarded by all this junk, and how do you even disentangle it and siphon it, and I feel like the only times where I start feeling like I have a little bit of control, or I'm kind of getting my thinking back, is when I go in to teach my classes and I don't let students use devices, and everyone, everyone has to put away all their devices, turn off everything electronic. And I've curated a reading list, that's my syllabus. I've chosen the reading we're going to talk about that day, and we're sitting there with the text, and I know these texts, and I know the reason we are reading these particular texts, and I have a set of questions I want us to grapple with, and I start feeling like, okay, we're focusing. Like the junk is kind of receding for a moment, and we're focusing. But I don't have a magical answer to this excellent question of how do we avoid being drowned.
If we ignored it, if we stopped watching the news, would we fall behind on seeing the danger, or at this point do we know and is giving it less attention of value?
It's a really good question, and I know people who do, stop watching. And
Hmm.
I've often felt like for reasons of sanity, it's probably better for one's mental acumen to take breaks, to
Yeah.
just try to kind of clear your mind. I would try to do that more, except because I'm a, quasi-public person. I have to know what's happening because journalists are asking me questions or editors are asking me questions. And I can't say, well, I haven't read that. I've tuned out the news and I've shut off everything for the past week. Although I think that would be a perfectly valid thing to do, but I'm kind of unable to do it. I feel like I have to know what's going on. But it's very, very hard to keep your mind clear.
Hmm.
And I don't, I do a lot of yoga. I obsessively go to spinning classes. I go to this, quasi-cult like spinning studio where they like turn the lights off and play the music very loud and don't let you bring a phone into the spinning studio. So, there's a whole 50 minutes on a stationary bicycle where I do not have access to the news. And I do find that clears my head for some little bit of time.
Yeah, I can see why. Professor, these things happen in steps. What do you think we should be looking at as next steps for Putin, for Trump?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very true. I mean, one of there's a famous lecture that Toni Morrison gave at Howard University in 1995, where she talks about the Holocaust, saying it went step by step by step. And more recently, at a commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz, Alexander von der Bellen, the Austrian president, said, Auschwitz ist nicht von Himmel gefallen. Auschwitz did not fall from the sky. And it sounds silly, but it's a very profound thing to say because it didn't come out of nowhere. You you push the boundaries, like the thing you thought was inconceivable, suddenly 3 months later is the new normal, and you've lost sight of the fact that you've normalized it. Um, I mean, people have said like this could never happen in the States. And wait, one thing I would say, and there's been some good writing about this as well, is that people mistakenly believe that because normal life goes on, nothing horrific is happening. And that is a fundamental mistake. Normal life also went on in Nazi Germany. To some extent, everyday life went on even in Moscow during the Stalinist terror. Like people still, like they get up and they get their kids ready for school and they go grocery shopping and like normal life will go on to the very last moment, essentially until people are themselves in the gas chamber. So the fact that you are going about your normal life does not mean that fascism is not happening. In some ways, it is precisely the fact that people will continue to go on their normal lives, that they will cling to that to the last possible moment that makes it all possible. There's a poem by Czesław Miłosz, Piosenko Końca Świata, a song about the end of the world, I think is the English translation. And the last lines are, in jego końca świata nie będzie, like that there will be no other end of the world. Like you think there's going to be fire and brimstone, but really everything's just going to be going on the way it was before. Everything's going to be going on in the manner of the everyday, the flowers and the snakes in the gardens, and it's all going to be there. And you're waiting for, the dramatic fire and brimstone and horses on the apocalypse. And really, this is it. Like the end of the world is here and you're not seeing it. And I don't know what needs to be done to, people need to be shaken out of that normality of the everyday. And that the everyday has such a strong pull,
Yeah.
that the need to live our everyday lives has such a strong pull. I understand that I have kids, like regardless of what happens, like you get up and get your kids ready for school.
Yeah. Professor, for you, as someone who is communicating often, what are you thinking about with your communication strategies? I mean, one thing you've done is you've moved. What else are you thinking about as far as how to communicate effectively around these topics?
Oh, it's a good question. Well, one thing, one thing I always think about, is how do we talk to different audiences? That's something you always think about as a teacher, as a
Yeah.
public speaker, as a writer. How do you communicate to different audiences? You're depending on the publication, depending on who is sitting in the room. What kinds of analogies can you use? What kinds of language can you use? What kinds of historical examples can you use? I mean, the historical examples I'm using are different depending on the demographics of the people in the room. I mean, not even necessarily, as in who is smart or who is stupid or who is more educated or who is less educated, but sometimes just generationally. Am I looking at people who remember the Cold War? Am I looking at young people who don't remember Obama's election? Not that anyone should feel good or bad about that. It's just that you always have to think about reaching out a hand to your audience and finding points of connection so that you are using references that the audience knows. You want to think
Yeah.
about the audience and try to, so I think about that. I think obsessively about how to keep the language fresh. That's something I owe to one of my former teachers, the American novelist Gilbert Sorrentino, who I studied with at Stanford back in the 90s. He's an avant-garde writer from New York who died of cancer years ago. But his preoccupation was you have to keep the language fresh. The language has to jump out of the page. You can't be using phrases that everybody always uses that already sound trite or cliched. It has to be new. One thing I've really struggled with is this feeling of running out of language, literally of running out of language to kind of express my disgust. But I don't think I have any magical recipes. I try to keep reading, and I try to keep reading things that are not just the news. I also try to keep reading fiction. I try to keep reading different kinds of text to put different kinds of references in my mind, so that I have different analogies or bridges to different audiences. Like one thing I thought of this is something your viewers will remember because it was only a little over a year ago, just before the elections, like the last 10 days after Michelle Obama's extraordinary speech where she makes this deep dive into the cost that women pay for restrictions on reproductive health care. And at the end of that, she looks at men and says, you are going to be the ones raising your children alone when their mothers die. And then she says to women, remember your vote is secret. The men will never know who you voted for. And then in the next couple days, there come out these secret voter ads. I think the Lincoln Project did one. Somebody else did one. And they are scenes of women coming to the polling place with their partners, their husbands, who are Trump supporters, warmly and friendly, and, of course, making the husbands believe, of course, they're all on the same page. Naturally, they're going to vote for Trump and, being warm and affectionate and going into the polling place and then these women exchanging these secret glances with one another, across the ceilings of the voting booths and then marking their ballots for Kamala. And the reassurance of the ad being, your husbands will never know. The men will never know you are safe. And I saw that and I thought, oh my God, that's like that. That's a scene right out of The Underground in The Handmaid's Tale. Quite literally. Like the subtext of that is violence. The subtext of that is these are women who are afraid of their husbands. And so one of the things I've done, when I've talked about that is I've talked to audiences about The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah.
I've talked to audiences about these dystopian scenes and what it means to be seeing them in real life.
Yeah. You have an ally in your husband, and in Jason Stanley. What do you think about in terms of how you work with other people?
It's a great question because, on the one hand, I'm obsessive compulsively controlling about my writing. I almost never co-author anything. I made one exception after I came back from a trip to Kiev, after a lot of bombing in spring of 2024. And I went with a close friend who's a literature professor in San Diego, Amelia Glazier, and we co-authored an op-ed for CNN at the time. But that was, I think, the only time perhaps I've ever really co-authored anything. I'm obsessively controlling about every word I write, but I also like to be conversationally in dialogue with lots of people.
Hmm.
I feel like, listening to people is a lot like reading, and that they're pushing your ideas forward, or they're putting ideas into your head that you may like or you may not like, but in any way is provoking you to think about something else. To think about
Mhm.
something you wouldn't have thought of if you were just inside your own head, So I'm very grateful for that. I mean, Tim and I met Jason just before the 2016 elections in New Haven, and that was really like a friendship that began very much from the trauma of those elections, and the sense that something devastating had happened, and around us, not everyone just understood just how devastating it was. And then we started talking a lot about fascism from our very different perspectives. Jason comes from analytical philosophy and the philosophy of language. I mean, his area of
Uh,
expertise is the language of propaganda and ideology. He comes from a very technical understanding of how language works. And Tim and I come from the perspective of being historians of Eastern Europe and historians of these totalitarian experiences. And I think and Jason's also an American, like, not, we're all American, but he's an Americanist. And his work in political philosophy had long been focused on American race relations, on mass incarceration. I think Tim and I learned a lot about America, about our own country from Jason. I think Jason learned a lot about Eastern Europe from us. He goes over there now. He goes to Kiev now. That's true with many, many interlocutors. Like, I'm so grateful for all of the smart and interesting people I'm able to talk to, because I really believe in the art of conversation. I believe in these dialogues as things that pushes one's thinking further. When I give talks, I find it much more interesting when it's in dialogue form, because I then always think of something I would not have thought if it were just me giving the lecture.
yeah, yeah. It's a lot of the joy of what I do. I get to listen to a lot of interesting people. One thing that you said there, something like there was a moment when you guys really started to talk about it. Was there a straw that broke the camel's back? I mean, we've talked about how this stuff comes on incrementally.
The elections. I would say in our house, I had no doubts that, we were heading for fascism when Trump won the election. Now, that said, I did not think he was going to win in
Hmm.
2016. Um, I wasn't confident. I was very, very nervous about it. But if I had to make a bet, I didn't think it was going to happen. Yeah, Tim was my husband at that time he voted absentee ballot. He was in Scandinavia, giving some lectures the day of the election. I took my two little kids with me to vote. They were then 4 and 6. And I kept them out of preschool and first grade, respectively, that morning so they could vote with me. And I'm saying kept them out in the morning because New Haven is so incompetent at running an election that you have to stand in line for hours in order to vote, which is effectively a form of disenfranchisement and should not be legal. And the last thing like little kids want to do is stand in line, but I dragged them anyway. Um,
Yeah.
because because I thought it was important, and because there had been so much tension in our house. And of course, they were too small then for us really to be talking to them about the election, but kids absorbed the atmosphere, and people had been dropping by and they had kind of picked up the conversations in the background. And Jason's kids they were even younger than ours were at the time. They were maybe 1.5 and 5. And so the 4 of the kids were running around a lot and absorbing things. And my 6-year-old said, as we were walking to the polling place, he said, "Mommy, if Hillary Clinton wins, all the grown-ups are going to calm down, right?" And I said, "Yes, yeah, we're all going to calm down. It's going to be okay. I know this has been a stressful period. I know you guys have felt a lot of tension in the house, but it's going to be okay. It's going to be over today. This is the last day." And then of course it wasn't. And I I never thought it was going to be okay. I had a very strong intuition that there was nothing okay about this, that we were going through this. I saw that what Trump was selling to people to a large extent, um, was precisely a kind of Dostoevskian world in which everything is permitted. After that Access Hollywood video came out, and, he's caught on microphone bragging about grabbing women, assaulting women, which should have ended that campaign and didn't. Yeah. I knew that we had crossed a kind of line after that. Michelle Obama gave what I thought was the single best speech of the whole 2016 campaign by anybody in New Hampshire after that Access Hollywood video. And I stupidly thought, that's it. It's over. He's not going to get a single vote from a single woman. And I was completely wrong. He got 53% of the vote of white women, which is just inexcusable. But I saw that what he was selling, people found him, his polls were saying people admire his honesty. And I thought, well, honesty here clearly doesn't mean correspondence between what he says and empirical reality, because there is no such correspondence. We're completely disconnected from empirical reality. But when people said honesty, when his supporters said honesty, they were seeing something that was real. And what was real is this absence of any kind of constraint. And it was right out of Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. Freud's idea was that really we are hardwired with what he called eros and thanatos. Really, we want to rape and kill one another all the time. That's just the human condition. Civilization is based on the repression of those instincts in such a way that they allow us to live together. It's based on repressing those instincts and channeling those desires, in less socially abusive ways so that we can live together as a society. Instead of killing one another, we can, say, play a soccer match. Instead of, raping one another, we can, get married and have some kind of I'm butchering Freud a little bit here, but you understand, society is based on controlling those impulses, in ways that are repressive, but are socially functional, and, Trump was offering people, he's saying, now if you see a woman walking down the street and you want to rape her, go ahead. Say that aloud. That's completely legitimate. There are no more rules. And Freud would say, yes, that kind of liberation from repression is authentic liberation. And for that, we pay the small price of the destruction of civilization. And we are paying that price. And I saw that was the price we were going to pay.
Mm. It seems mistaking brazenness for honesty is maybe the error there.
Well, the error is saying, I see that woman, I want to rape her. That might be honest. That might be truthful. This giving our free rein to all this kind of lock her up, send her back, grab her, that may very well be honest, but there's a reason why there are rules. There's a reason why there's a rule of law. There's a reason why we all don't get to do everything we feel like doing or have an impulse to do all the time. Right. There are good reasons to constrain our impulses not to rape and kill one another.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about how technology is changing things. It seems we are all a little bit more surveilled with each day, that there is more technology tracking us and things. One thing in your earlier books and things, you talk about how transparency and being on social media can be helpful, but there's also a price to pay that people are sacrificing their privacy effectively to get what they need. What do you think about privacy as we go forward?
That's something else that terrifies me, and I don't feel I'm able to absorb the implications in real time. As quickly as I should. I mean, you ask, how do we think in real time? And in some ways, weakly, in some way, poorly in that sense. I mean, one of the reasons why I always feel less secure writing about the present is because all of historians' advantages come from retrospect. Hegel's Owl of Minerva, looking back, you can know more than anyone could know at the time, and you see how things played out. And the ways in which this transparency and this invasion of privacy is playing out, I don't feel we can fully absorb it in real time. I mean, one of the classic characteristics of 20th century totalitarianism was this drive towards transparency, was what Hannah Arendt describes as the effacing of the distinction between the public and the private sphere. This aspiration for transparency. Before Stalinism, there were other tyrannical regimes, and they were concerned with what you did, but they weren't concerned with what you said to your lover in bed, and they weren't concerned with your thoughts in the same way. Whereas under Stalinism, they were. Like, having bourgeois thoughts was also a crime. That kind of total invasion of any kind of private space. Technologically now, we're all like, and some people are embracing it. I mean, some people just stream themselves, effectively 24 hours a day. I mean, it's this kind of complete insanity. And I don't think anyone has fully absorbed the implications of that. I don't feel like I don't even trust my own judgments about that. I try very hard to keep my kids off. Like, my kids are teenagers now. They don't have social media accounts. I don't let them post pictures of themselves. I try very hard not to let other people post pictures of my kids. When my kids are around, I try not to let them get in any photos, of me or my husband that are likely to be posted on the internet. I do the best I can. But, of course, we are public people. And so every time I give a talk, someone is recording, or someone is tweeting, or someone is taking pictures, or someone is posting, and I don't even know how much to try to rein that in and control it if it's kind of not possible to control anyway. I don't know. I don't understand so much what the implications will be in the future as we go on. The idea that anything you say at any moment can be recorded and you can be held to it forever. I mean, I think in some ways it's easier for me because I was used to writing and publishing and teaching, kind of before this widespread era of the internet. I think it's harder for my students because when I stood in front of a classroom, even before anyone could record anything, I understood that anything I said was effectively public. There could be 10 students in my class, there could be 100 students in my class, there could be 500, but I knew that what I was saying there, I had to be accountable for. I knew that even if there were no devices, as students were taking notes, I have to take responsibility for every word. Even when I was writing long pre-internet and my kind of very early, teenage undergraduate things, you knew if you sent something to press, even if there were only a few copies of that publication, even if it was obscure, once it was there, you are responsible for every word you wrote. You can be held to that forever, and so I had some intuitive sense, of what it meant to speak publicly and to put one's words out there. I didn't have that visually. Like, I still find it very awkward to be, videoed or the photographs. But I had that about the content of what I said from teaching and from writing. I look at my students now and they're so used to, like, they don't even have any sense of, like, what it might mean to be, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, held accountable for these exchanges or silly thoughts you had drunk at 3 a.m.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Professor, too, the constant, lifting of the video camera. We're often filmed when we don't even know it, don't agree to it. What can we take from history about how to sense when this has gone too far? Maybe we can't predict where it's going, but how do we know when the surveillance is encroaching on us?
The surveillance is certainly already encroaching on us.
And what are some indicators of that?
I mean, the fact that, you can Google image anyone, the fact that these targeted ads, the algorithms, are terrifying. Just the fact that, okay, you're looking for a pair of like boots with non-slip soles on the ice and you Google it, like even something completely like non-problematic like that, or say something like, I don't care if anybody knows that, like, okay, it's icy, I'm looking for boots with non-slip soles. But then you get, on your Facebook account or on something else, you suddenly get all these ads from other companies that have boots with non-slip soles because the internet knows everything about you and your algorithm are being calculated, and you're trying to opt out from every website on these cookies, but you can't possibly opt out of everything as quickly as you're going. And all of this data on you, the ability to micro-target audiences with political messages. I mean, this is also something that I think has changed. I mean, our electoral college system was always messed up. I mean, that was always going to be a vulnerability. And I grew up in Pennsylvania, which is a swing state. So I have a sense of what it means to be in a swing state and to know that, okay, you're voting here, it matters more. But it didn't used to be the case that you could scientifically predict, street by street, exactly which districts and which swing states were going to matter and which were the particular issues and vulnerabilities that people in neighborhood X would have. And then you target your ads exactly to them. I mean, that kind of like the troll factories, the ability to manipulate public opinion by using your data, which is somehow out there. People know what kinds of food you like to order from Uber Eats and what kind of shoes you like to buy and, what you're looking at, what you're looking at on the internet or what you've Googled or that. And then you have a troll factory in Petersburg, and they can manage to convince people that Hillary Clinton is kidnapping children and holding them captive in the basement of a Washington, D.C. pizzeria to exploit for child pornography. And you can target those messages in such a way that millions of Americans believe it. It arguably swings the election, and a guy goes into the pizzeria and starts shooting to liberate the children.
On an individual scale, the devil's advocate here is, well, I would never fall for something like that. And, who cares if I get targeted ads because I would want to find better boots faster anyway. So, I mean, what's the issue on the level of the individual who's confident in their own decision making? I mean, are there other risks?
Yeah, it's a good question. The sense that people can gather enormous amount of information on you, I feel is an inherent risk.
Can they give you lies? I mean, if it's targeted, can a candidate tell you that they're going to back this issue and then tell your neighbor that they're going to fight this issue?
Oh,
I mean, can they give completely different worlds?
Yes, and even if it's not the candidate themselves, it doesn't need to be the candidate
it can
themselves.
Be
So many of these interest groups or these lobby groups that were playing these roles in the election, were coming from Russia or coming from other parts of the world. Or, I mean, some of them, my husband did much more research on this than I did, but, the website was like, the English wasn't even grammatically correct. And it was clearly set up by a non-native speaker. But anybody can pretend to be anyone and throw any message you need in any kind of strange way. And this was the innovation that Putin's spin doctors had, that Vladislav Surkov in particular had, that you could play this game by simultaneously sending opposite and contradictory messages, to confuse people, to lure in different people for different reasons at different times. You just had to get them together at a certain moment for a certain election. Then you could kind of let that coalition fall away and then you could play with them in some other way. This idea that it's all a game, that it can all be manipulated, that nothing is permanent, that the distinction between reality and non-reality is very porous, that personalities can be manipulated, that issues can be created. All of this is being done on a level that's never been imaginable before.
Mm-hmm. Professor, how important is our privacy? I mean, if we post on the internet where we go, what we do, we've talked a little bit about people getting disappeared, which is a strange and dystopian thing to talk about in America. How real is that? Is it really happening here? And what's the risk of privacy?
I do worry about that, and this has been the first time where I worry about our government and not just, about, say, the Russian government. I mean, this idea of being careful not to post about where one is at the time you're actually there, that was something I would, I think about, when I go to Ukraine during the war, not because of the Ukrainians, but rather because of Russian intelligence. I've really debated at times, like, okay, if I'm going to give a lecture in Kiev, do I really want it posted ahead of time, like where I'm going to be before I'm there? Do I want to post being there when I'm there, or do I want to post only after I'm no longer there? So and it's the first time really, since in the past year that I've started thinking about that with respect to the American government as well. Like,
Mhm.
do I really, if I'm in the States, do I really want that, announced exactly where I'm going to be? And no, it's terrifying. I mean, somewhat, and academics are very easy to stalk because we're constantly giving lectures or classes, or
Of course.
it's very easy to find us. Um, there are moments when I get worried about that. There are moments when I just kind of give up and say, well, what can I do? This is what I do. I can't say this is a secret lecture or a secret class. I mean, I guess I could, but that starts to seem crazy and paranoid. And how do you know when you're being crazy and paranoid? And how do you know when you're just being rational? I mean, I'm not, the primary target group. I think a lot about what would happen to a lot of my foreign students. I mean, I worry, now when, my husband goes to the States, I think I worry more than when he goes to Ukraine. You're always worried more when it's somebody, like somebody close to you who's in danger than when you yourself are. Like, I'm always much more nervous when he's in Ukraine than I am when I'm in Ukraine. But I now worry, if he's, speaking at the No Kings rally, I'm like, don't announce that ahead of time. I don't want that on the internet. Like, I don't want people to know where you're going to be when you're going to be there.
Hmm. Is it freeing when sometimes you decide just not to fight it?
Yeah. Um, when I'm feeling less paranoid, well, it's in some sense. I mean, I'm not a very brave person. I mean, I don't know if freeing. It's like, I also think, well, I'm not such an important person. Like, I'm probably not going to be, somebody's first target. But I also feel like anything is possible. And my terror after the Charlie Kirk murder is that this is going to be like Kirov's murder in 1934 in the Soviet Union, or like Horst Wessel's murder in Germany, or like the Reichstag fire. Like, this is going to become the provocation, for a wave of terror. And so what I do know is that anything is possible. I feel like we are in a
Hmm.
situation where anything is possible, and, you know, like that can, there are moments when it makes me completely paranoid. There are moments when I'm like, since anything is possible, nothing can be done anyway. And so, you can't just hide in your room every day.
Well, Professor Marci Shore, for people who want to follow along with your very curated set of things that you put online, before we get to our last question, where's the best place for people to look for you?
Oh, that's okay. So I have a website at the Munk School, or there's a faculty page, and there's now a new addition to the faculty page that will be posting, that will be posting all the articles and videos and media appearances. I try to do some curating, of, my Monk webpage will have my text, and then I try to use social media largely to post other people's text and appearances, and to often with an epigraph or a quote to kind of draw people's attention to what I think is particularly crucial.
We'll put some links in the description for people to check out. And Dr. Marci Shore, last, you have a lot on your mind, obviously. What do you think that you'd like people to take away from this discussion or consider going forward?
Um, well, my my friend Ivan Krastev, a brilliant political commentator, wrote to me after the election, and he said, hope is what is there when nothing else is left.
Hmm.
And so I try to keep that in mind. I try to keep in mind that all tyrannical regimes eventually fall. Um, and I cling to that, and I brought children in the world. And I click to the memory of the Ukrainian Revolution in 2014, which was, the first, in some sense, the only revolution I was kind of watching in real time. And again, it was something that seemed impossible till the moment that it happened, and I watched a critical mass of people cross over to the other side of fear at the same time and find things in themselves they never would have expected. And for me, the Maidan was a revelation, and a reminder of the fact that we human beings are capable of something better. And even if that only manifests itself, for the blink of an eye, and even if only for a short time in a fragile, ephemeral way, and historically very rarely, the fact that it can ever happen means that it is possible. And I continue to cling to that hope.
Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful note to end on. And Dr. Marci Shore, I really appreciate you for having the courage to talk about these things, for writing about it, and for taking this interview with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching my interview. To go even deeper on these ideas, you can watch my interview with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Anne Applebaum. Links to that interview and everything else we discussed are in the description.